The transition of life from marine inhabitants into terrestrial dwelling creatures has long been a key area of interest for scientists. This is because it is widely regarded as a hugely important landmark in evolutionary history. In order for life to make its way onto land, there needed to be many evolutionary changes to make terrestrial living possible. Tetrapod means 4 feet, and so is used to define any species descended from the first tetrapod ancestor. This means tetrapoda includes species that don't have the 4-footed characteristics of their encompassing name, including snakes and cetaceans, due to their subsequent secondary loss, as well as the bipeds, which have evolved to walk on just 2 of their limbs. The transition of locomotion from swimming to walking is thought to have occurred just once throughout history. Coelacanths were until recently believed to be the closest living relative of tetrapods. However, in recent times, the lungfish has been described as the true closest living relative, and thus should in theory resemble the perfect model organism from which to assess the fin-to-limb transition. However, in practice this is not necessarily the case, mainly due to the lungfish's gargantuan genome size. Selected intermediary fossils provide an impeccable transitional overview of the fin-to-limb transition. Arguably the most important of these fossils are those of the Eusthenopteron, which had clear and obvious fins, Dendropiton, which clearly exhibited limbs, and between them Tiktaalik, which represents an exemplary midpoint and has thus been dubbed a fishapod. Eusthenopteron was highly typical of early fish in many respects. It grew up to 1 meter in length and possessed a defined humerus, radius, and ulna, from which the limb later developed. Visually, Pandorictes is a much more tetrapod-like organism, seen through the loss of its dorsal and anal fins, a flatter skull with a longer snout, and larger shoulder girdle. Tiktaalik possesses many key features of both early fish and tetrapods alike. Its fins show a joint construction resembling the wrist movement of limbs, and although not strong enough to bear weight on land, could have been used to aid the lifting of the organism's head above the water to breathe. This is supported by evidence of larger spiracles on top of the head, and changes to gill structure, as well as a shoulder girdle that is no longer attached to the skull, forming a primitive neck structure. Despite these radical changes in physiology, retainment of the fin rays means Tiktaalik is still technically a fish. Acanthostega retains many fish-like features, but unlike Tiktaalik, it is defined as an early tetrapod. This is due to the development of limbs with digits. It is believed to have still been a marine organism due to the retainment of gill bars, but is also believed to have gulped air. Although it possessed a strong femur and developed pelvic girdle, this was only connected to the column by soft tissue, suggesting that it could still not bear its own weight on land. The limb terminates in 8 digits, most likely enveloped in a web, suggesting the limbs were first evolved as a paddle for movement through water. Dendropiton is from the order Temnospondyli, defined as non-amniotic tetrapods. It has 5 digits at the end of its forearm, and was able to bear its own weight on land. The only living organisms from this lineage are the modern amphibians, meaning it is likely that in the same way we refer to birds as living dinosaurs, modern-day amphibians are probably living temnospondyls. Paddlefish are of the class Actinopterygii, which is split from the lineage of Sarcopterygii that contains the coelacanths, lungfish, and tetrapods. The two groups exhibit similar HOXD11 and 13 expression, supporting the notion that the genetic toolkit for hands and feet was already present in primitive fish species, and is therefore homologous and was not evolved independently. After the initial budding of a fin or limb via fibroblast growth factors, an apical ectodermal ridge is formed, which controls further outgrowth. A zone of polarizing activity secretes the sonic hedgehog protein. Sonic hedgehog, in part, controls HOXD expression and timing, which is the main driver of the differences between fins and limbs. In Gnathostomes, the lineage where pectoral and pelvic fins were first developed, and the paddlefish, there is a highly conserved HOXD13 expression pattern. The HOX gene is expressed posteriorly during the early development, and the apical ectodermal ridge is lost relatively early, forming what is called an apical ectodermal fold. Later in development, HOXD13 is expressed across the entire length of the bud, but is truncated by the early forming apical ectodermal fold, resulting in a less developed endoskeleton. The zebrafish also shows a highly conserved mechanism, but the expression of HOXD13 remains relatively unchanged throughout development, resulting in additionally diminished endoskeletal bones and relatively longer fin rays. In the tetrapod mouse, the limb bud formation remains largely unchanged in early development, but a much larger expression domain of HOXD13 at later stages, aided by the complete removal of the apical ectodermal fold boundary, results in a much greater temporal modulation of the endoskeletal limb structures, thus giving rise to tetrapod digits as well as other complex structures.